Welcome back to Around the Table with Stacy Smith as we take a look at the economy and investing. You've probably seen the stories like this sub-headline in the Wall Street Journal recently. Quote, "There's never been a worse time to buy instead of rent. It's now 52% more expensive to buy a home than to rent one because of climbing mortgage rates." Or this line from another story. Roughly 90% of mortgaged homes have a rate below 6%, according to calculations from Mark Fleming, chief economist at First American Financial Corporation. About 2/3 of American households own their own home, according to the Census Bureau. Many people locked in lower rates and then inflation takes off, but it only affects half their budget, according to Fleming. And homeowners essentially have this great hedge against inflation. So, Frank, mortgage rates are now at their highest level since the year 2000 and approaching 8%, by the way, and housing sales are down 13%. So what do you make of the housing market right now?
It's a conundrum. You've got high building costs. You've got a shrinking in the housing stock because we're not building as fast as we're tearing down old properties. We've got the millennials who are moving into homes because they're expanding their households. We grew 400,000 households in a period. I can't remember whether it was 22 or 20 this so far this year. Not that it matters. And this is creating demand for supply that does not exist. We've got people like me who have a low interest rate mortgage, who are, even if I wanted to move, where would I go? And the issues that exist are very high. So you've got homes that normally people would be moving on to the next phase of their life, but because interest rates rose, it doesn't make sense economically for them to give up what they have in order to have that, unless they have no mortgage. And if you have no mortgage, then you don't have that problem, but that's not that common. So we've got all these problems. We've got high building costs. We're growing households. We have high construction costs, which are making homes expensive, and then add on to it the expense of the money, and it becomes a very difficult environment for people who are not making an enormous amount of money. I liken it to, Stacy, when we were young, we were buying houses and paying 12 and 13 and 14% mortgages. You may recall that.
Oh, yeah.
And about when you and I moved to this city, as a matter of fact, and we bought less house than people are buying today. And that's probably where it's got to go. Instead of buying a 3,000 or 4,000 square foot 5-bedroom home, you might buy a 2,400 square foot 4-bedroom home, and or whatever you do what you can afford. And down payments are being required that are higher. The building industry eventually will start financing that, but they've got to get their supply issues straightened out so they can actually build homes. And throw in the government obstruction that goes on with building permits and doing everything you have to do, and everything just takes a lot longer than it needs to. So there's a lot of issues there, and they're not revolving around lack of demand. It's a lack of the available supply, which is inflationary. Mike's biggest concern.
Yeah, I would agree with what Frank's saying, that the supply demand factors are really out of balance with the housing market. However, I do feel as though we're in a transition where we're sitting here, like, there might be people saying, well, I'm not going to move because I don't want to pay the higher interest rates. But at some point, you still have to live your life. And as Frank alluded to, you paid higher interest rates, back in the 80s. So there will come a time where you can only put your life on hold for so long. And the result of that will be two things. It will be what Frank mentioned, that, you're not buying the McMansion anymore. You're going to make do with a smaller house. But the other thing that will suffer is consumer spending, because if now I'm paying, and these are real numbers, $1,000 more in a mortgage just because interest rates went up, that's $1,000 I'm not going to be spending at Target and at other places.
Correct me if I'm wrong on this, but at some point I recall when they started raising interest rates, the Fed chair said that, they wanted to bring down the housing market a little bit. I mean, the big spurge that was going on there with these lower interest rates. Is this what they anticipated to have happening, where it would be this tight of a housing market? Is this what they wanted?
There's something that came about when they started doing this that no one anticipated or expected the result. It was called the COVID pandemic. It just turned everything upside down, and it caused things to happen that wouldn't normally have happened, mostly on the supply side of things. Also on the demand side, when people started working from home, they needed a bigger home, so they started buying homes. I mean, and they did it with low interest rates. Now they have bigger homes and they can work from home, and if they're still able to work from home, there's all these. I mean, this is not a simple issue. It's very complex, and COVID did nothing to help the ability of the Fed or anyone else to figure out what they ought to be doing.
Yeah, I think
I'm
go ahead,
sorry,
Gary, please.
I was just going to say, I'm really interested. I don't know this data yet, but I'm really interested to see like what segment of the housing market is kind of struggling the most, right? Because as Frank mentioned, you have a lot of millennials that are looking to buy their first home. So that lower end may not be suffering at all. The people on the super high end can afford it, so they're going to do it. So is it that middle market? I don't know, but it would be interesting to look into that.
The problem is these numbers they'll come out next July for this year. So
Yeah.
they're so old when we see them, I'm not sure they're valid anymore.
Yeah.
It is to your point, such a big lag, but you got to really feel for these first time home buyers who just missed out on a 3% interest rate by maybe a year plus. But, Carrie's point before in terms of how this really kind of impacts your discretionary income, that matters, right? And this is sort of a roundabout way to get into your point, Stacy. Is this what the Fed wanted to do? I don't think they really wanted to make sure consumers' belts were tightened that much. I think they were probably hoping that home prices would come down a little bit. They haven't. They continue to actually increase in value, even with an 8% rate, just because, as Frank mentioned, the supply of single family homes has fallen off a cliff really since the global recession or the financial crisis back in 2008. We've never been able to catch up. We've never been able to keep pace with the growing amount of households that have come to fruition over the past decade or so. So again, you in the end, you might get to that point where, housing prices come down, especially if people own their third house or their secondary vacation home or something. Those should come down obviously a lot quicker than in anybody's primary residence. But again, this is all part and parcel to bringing the inflation problem more or less under control. It's just taking a little bit longer than I think anybody would have anticipated.
All right, we have to take a break. We'll be back in just a moment.